Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Katie Kiersey, and I run marketing and community here at Right Side Up. For those of you who aren't familiar, Right Side Up is a collective of growth marketing specialists who have helped more than 300 VC-backed tech companies hit their goals. We cover virtually all paid channels, SEO, CRO, email marketing, analytics, and more. Today's webinar is all about resourcing effective, efficient, growth-oriented marketing teams. Over the past 5 years, we've spoken with thousands of high-growth companies looking for guidance on their growth strategies. One of the questions we hear most often is, how should I build out my marketing team? And there's certainly no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. A good strategy is always tailored to your unique business goals. But speaking with companies across all industries and stages of growth has enabled us to build a strategic framework to help companies think about and answer this question. It's also given us a holistic bird's eye view of hiring trends across the board, including how COVID-19 has changed the way companies are thinking about resourcing their marketing programs. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Tyler Elliston. Tyler started Right Side Up to help solve the very problems he faced as a founder and in-house marketing executive. Hiring excellent talent to hit aggressive growth goals is really hard. He's got a lot of great material planned to share what he's learned about building excellent growth teams over the past few years. Before I turn it over to Tyler, I wanted to mention a couple of important housekeeping items. First, please submit any and all questions throughout the duration of this session using Zoom's Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. We'll plan to address as many of them as we can in the last 20 to 25 minutes. Second, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing the recording along with Tyler's slides with you via email in the days following the session. And that's all I've got. So with that said, Tyler, I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome, thanks, Katie. I'm really excited to be talking about this. My first experience with staffing teams really started when I started a company in 2008. And it was very early stage, and we had, all of these dreams of what we wanted to accomplish, and we had, very little resources. And so we were trying to figure out how to combine FTEs and agencies and freelancers to hit our goals. And frankly, that first attempt was just a failure. And then I did a handful of in-house roles where I was a director or VP of marketing, managing teams, managing agencies, and in some cases freelancers, and sort of started to hone my thinking on it. And then with Right Side Up, really, this is where I would say I've learned the most, because we've, as Katie mentioned, we've worked with hundreds of companies, we've talked to thousands, understanding what their teams look like, what they're finding is working, what's not, what they like about agencies and don't like about agencies. Same for freelancers and in-house. So this is an attempt to share some of those learnings. A couple of disclaimers. So, these conclusions are based on a collection of experience and anecdotes. It's subjective, and I think that's why it's actually really rich conversation. There's not a hard and fast rule that applies everywhere. There really is a lot of nuance that kind of dictates what makes sense in a particular situation. So yes, strategy is tailored and exceptions abound. And if you go through this session and you don't feel like you have guidance for your particular situation, then reach out. We'd love to talk to you about it. These are a handful of clients we've worked with. I'll skip through this. You can also see clients on our website. This should be fun and informative. We are hoping that we get some engagement via the Q&A. As Katie mentioned, the material will be shared. Please don't distribute it. All right, so without further ado, these are the topics I want to cover. First, I want to go through the pros and cons of full-time employees, agencies, and freelance marketers. And I'll talk a little bit about keys for success in each of these, and then we'll apply some of those sort of guideposts to some real world applications around what stage a company is in. So either pre-product market fit, growth, or a mature organization. How some of the typical norms sort of crafting that best-in-class team in those different stages. And then we'll take questions. So full-time employees. There are a handful of really good things about full-time employees. This is sort of the standard, the de facto. The biggest thing is that they're deeply ingrained in the company and its mission, and also with its people. And so the level of commitment that you get and the support for what you're trying to build, even from a missional standpoint, not just a sort of deliverable standpoint, is very high with full-time employees. Also, because of that, both the mission and people, they tend to stick around longer than external resources. And so, clearly, if you are wanting to minimize sort of churn and the cost of recruiting, full-time employees are really good. They also can more effectively access information that they need to be successful in their jobs. So a lot of roles, in order to be successful, you've got to be able to work really well with data science or creative, or even like the founders. If it's like an early stage company doing product marketing and the brand is central to how you would message the company, for example. And so sometimes it's hard for anybody external to really fully understand the dynamics of a founder's vision or a company culture in a way that can make external resources, it can make it harder for them to be successful, where full-time employees really shine. The cons of full-time employees are also non-trivial. These are the reasons that they aren't the only solution we see commonly deployed. One, and I would argue one of the biggest, is that they don't evolve as quickly as the business will evolve. So, especially at an early stage, businesses change really quickly. The skills that a company needs, the seniority of those people, how many hours a week, just pure like, this marketing team needs 100 cumulative hours or 150 cumulative hours. There's like a Q4 launch and we need to, really spike, and it really needs to spike on these skills. And FTEs are just rigid, right? Like people can't learn and become excellent in really specialized skills that quickly. And so companies will find themselves sort of out of equilibrium where they really need skills that they don't have, or seniority that they don't have, or the capacity is off. Great talent is really hard to recruit and retain. So there are a lot of companies that just can't hire A+ talent for one reason or another, or in a particular area. And in those cases, the quality of the work can actually be lower with an FTE than external, just because you can't simply, it's not choosing A+ FTE or A+ external. It's like A+ external or B+ FTE. There are social, financial, and cultural costs of making the wrong hire. We saw this a lot with COVID. So when the recovery first started, right after COVID last summer, a lot of companies had made cuts. They were seeing really good signs that their business was actually doing at least okay, if not really well. They were very hesitant to make full-time hires because they were afraid that they would be, they would make the wrong decisions, they would get capacity wrong, and then they would end up in this situation again where they were having to make cuts. And then lastly, a con of full-time employees is that they're more prone to groupthink and bound by institutional orthodoxy. So it's kind of the flip side of sort of having access and being part of the mission and part of the team. That's a very good thing. The downside, of that coin is that sometimes companies develop these orthodoxies around, like, pay doesn't work, or customers buy this product for this reason. And sometimes those are right, and data, and grounded in reality. In other cases they're not. And sometimes with full-time employees it can be hard to really get that contrarian thinking. So a few things specific to growth marketing that we see with FTEs. So one is a scope that is too broad. So this is especially true for early stage, where a company might have 2 marketing team members, but they're asking them to do 10 different things. And it doesn't matter, even if they had the skills to do all of those with excellence, they wouldn't be able to do a great job, just because each of those needs more focus to be successful than they're currently getting. The second one is kind of related, is lacking the specialization. Very few people have, very few people are excellent at 8 different things. And so, most people are excellent at 1 or 2 or 3 things. And so if you ask one person to do, 4 different things that are really different skill sets, the chances are they're, 95% good at one, and they're 60% good at another, and 30% good at another. And as channels and marketing tactics have become increasingly specialized it really is leaving a lot of results on the table, so to speak, to have a generalist do something that is really specialized. Third, expecting to pay median salary to 95th percentile talent. I would point the finger right at myself for this. The first venture that I started, I viewed it as I wrongly viewed it as sort of a badge of honor to get a good deal on, on labor. And what actually I was doing was simply bracketing out any and all excellent talent that understood their worth. And that was a big mistake that I made. And we see that very commonly, really, with companies of all stages, where they have a very high bar. Sometimes they even know what excellence really looks like, but the pay just doesn't just doesn't support it. And in our opinion, that's a big mistake, because A+ talent really does serve as a multiplier. You can grow a lot faster when you have truly excellent people. And then lastly, conflicting goals. So, I'll use an example from performance marketing. Um, you know, a single team should not be tasked with decreasing CAC, increasing volume, and increasing lifetime value all at the same time, because those are contradictory in some ways. Like CAC and reducing CAC and increasing volume, the tactics that you do are diametrically opposed. And so for successful teams, what we see most commonly is either having separate teams or separate people be responsible for different goals, or sequencing it. It's like, okay, this quarter our goal is to maximize our volume and to do that within a CAC constraint. Next quarter, we're going to try to reduce our CAC. That's going to be the goal within a volume constraint. And so we encourage companies to look at contradictory goals as a primary goal and a constraint, versus two maximization or minimization exercises, which do just fundamentally oppose one another. So let's talk about agencies. So starting with the pros and cons there. So the pros of agencies, they bring a really specialized skill set, certainly more than a generalist that you would hire as an FTE. They can scale very quickly. So, if you're a company and you're spending $100,000 a month and it's going really well, and you have a mandate to spend, $2 million a month, that would be a great time to talk to some agencies about how they can help you. They can onboard very quickly, and they can deploy many people very quickly. And so those are wonderful pros of agencies, especially when you've sort of proven something out and are looking to supercharge it. A few cons. One is that most, not all, but most require a high level of commitment. So 6-12 month contracts. If you're just exploring and trying to figure something out, that is quite inconvenient. If you are deeply committed to a channel and you've proven it out, that is no problem. They tend to be expensive and price based on the value that they provide. And so in some ways that's very fair. In another way, it's like, okay, as an FTE, you're buying somebody's time, and the company is capturing any sort of additional value that's created over their time. So an agency is sort of is sharing in that upside, which again can make a ton of sense. Usually there's a point where companies are like, okay, we're spending 500K a month or $1 million a month, where they kind of do the math on like, wow, okay, and how many FTEs could this support? Okay, maybe we'll think about bringing this in-house, which has a ton of pros and cons on its on its own. Inflexible playbooks. So normally, the most common path for somebody to create an agency is, somebody's really good at a channel. Like, let's take Facebook. Somebody's really good at Facebook. They start, companies start hiring that person to do Facebook. Then they get more work than they can do themselves, and so they hire somebody. Typically, it's a low-cost resource that they train on their playbooks. Like, this is how I do Facebook. And so then that trained resource can then take on clients. That works well in a lot of situations. Where it does not work well is when you need flexibility. So one situation is if the playbook does not work, So if they apply the playbook and CAC is out of control and it's like, man, this is not even viable, we need to think outside the box. That is often a tough problem for agencies in our experience. Another example of this is uh, asking them to do channels or tasks outside of their playbook. So if you ask for help on, TikTok and their playbook is on Facebook, um, in a bad situation, you would get sort of like a Facebook playbook sort of crudely applied to TikTok, which would lead to failure, rather than an agency who's developed a playbook specifically for TikTok. Lastly, they're margin sensitive, and so one way that we see this play out is companies sometimes will say, "Oh, we need to do this and this and this and this," and there's like creative things that need to happen, and landing page things that need to happen, and audiences to explore. And sometimes companies will get frustrated because all those ideas and tasks sort of get put on a timeline over 3 months or 6 months, and part of that is like you can only test so many things at one time to get good data. Part of it also though is that if an agency deploys a lot of time on any one account in any given week or month, they're going to be underwater, they're going to lose money. And so there's understandably and reasonably targets where an agency is like, okay, we're charging X% of spend, this is going to be our fee per month. Like, we really don't want to deploy more than X hours against that retainer this month. And so while that makes sense for the agency and you can understand why they would do that, they don't want to lose money. In some situations, like a company that wants to move very, very quickly and test a lot of different things, that model doesn't always work really well. So when to hire an agency, I've talked about some of these. I'll go through them quickly. One is if your project requires many individuals to execute against a shared objective. Two, you lack the internal capacity to oversee a multi-stakeholder project on a regular basis. You want something prepackaged and don't have time for missteps. So, some companies say, hey, I want to tinker with it, I want to understand it, I don't mind if we go down the wrong path, I just want to get the data. If you want to just like have a solid playbook applied to your business, then an agency is the way to go. Even if you hire an agency, we would typically recommend that an internal team member act as a point person, working with them specifically on the strategy and the objectives. We do, probably the most common complaint we hear from people about agencies is they just don't give them the strategic support that they're looking for. Sometimes companies hire agencies hoping or expecting that that the agency will very proactively tell them exactly what they need to do and when and how. And the reality is that it usually is much more reactive. Usually it is much more, okay, here's the update, here are some thoughts that we have, but often the company is the one kind of pushing it forward and saying, what about this, what about this, what about this? And that's just sort of the way it is. And so the way we advise people to sort of go into an agency relationship to find mutual success, one of them is just don't expect that. Like, you're not getting a CMO, you're not getting a director of performance marketing. Like, that is not what the agency model is for. The agency model is really good for channel execution and channel strategy, sort of rolling up into a larger strategy that's owned internally. We would always recommend interviewing people that are going to work on your account, preferably before you sign a contract. There are some great performance marketers that work at agencies. There are also people at agencies that are not great performance marketers. And so we very routinely will hear, oh, agency X is awesome. And then, later we'll hear someone else talk about that same agency and be like, man, they suck. And, and really when we dig into it, it's the specific people. People are what drive it, along with the playbook, but the playbook alone is not enough. And so we never think it's taboo or out of line to say, hey, we really want to interview whoever's going to be touching our account and data. The last thing I would say here, and this applies to freelancers as well, treat them as part of your team and build rapport with your account lead. Some companies view external resources um, as sort of arm's length vendors that whose goal should simply be to like appease the client and do whatever they're told. And I would just say that that is not how you get the most out of people. You really want an agency or a freelancer to feel like part of your team, just like an FTE. Part of the reason they're doing the work is because they care about their craft, but part of it is because they want to do it for you, their manager. They want you to be proud. They want you to be happy. They want you to be, a someone that would recommend them for future jobs, somebody that would connect them to future jobs. And it's really no different with freelancers and agencies. But it is, it definitely is a little bit contrarian to look at it that way. All right, so freelancers. So this is the third of the three buckets, and then we'll kind of talk about piecing them together. So the pros of freelancers, the biggest is that you can acquire really deep subject matter expertise. In this world where things are getting really specialized, freelancers are an awesome source where it's like, man, I need somebody that knows this inside and out. Freelancer is a good place to find it. Two, try before you buy. This kind of can apply on two levels. One, you can try a specific person before you buy them, figuratively speaking, as an FTE. The other way that this sort of try before you buy concept applies is with a general job description. So there's sometimes companies will think that they need a particular kind of person. They're not totally sure. They'll hire a freelancer to start doing the job. And once that person's doing the job, they'll realize like, well, gosh, now that we've been doing it, now we know we don't need this, we do need that. We want somebody a little bit more senior, a little more junior. We really want them to have this attribute or that attribute. And so that really helps you sort of, measure twice, cut once on the FTE if you've experienced it with a freelancer. Flexibility to scale hours up and down. This is another huge one. As I mentioned before, business need changes so frequently and quickly. Freelancers, because you can turn them up or down, on or off, it gives you this like outlet workforce that you can lean into, lean out of, to make sure that at any given time you've got the right set of skills. And then lastly, on the pro side, fresh and unbiased perspectives. This is sort of the flip side of the coin of like sometimes they lack sort of the commitment to the mission. Sometimes they lack the internal connections. The benefit of that attribute is that they bring fresh and unbiased perspectives. They can be contrarians in a way that you need contrarians. The cons of freelancers, it's hard to find them at the right time. That's the right fit. They tend to be less committed to the mission, more quote unquote mercenary. And then third, it can be challenging to succeed in very senior or cross-functional roles. So it certainly carries risk if you have an internal team of 20 people. To have a freelancer come in as a VP of marketing is tough, right? Like that role needs to be deeply committed to the people on the team. They need to manage them very carefully. And as a company, you would want to project deep commitment to the company, which hiring a freelancer in a VP role, can undermine that message. It's not to say that it should never happen, but it is less frequent, I think, for this reason. So when to hire freelancers? So there are a lot of situations where it can make sense. Part-time needs where you just don't need an FTE yet, but you think you might in the future. Short-term or temporary support, so seasonality or maternity or paternity leaves, testing an unproven need. It's like, all right, we don't want to hire an FTE if this may not work, so let's prove it out. Immediate needs when you're unable to hire fast enough. So sometimes companies will hire, $20 million. They're at a unique inflection point in their company and in the macro environment where it's like, gosh, we need to grab as much land as we can as quickly as we can. Freelancers are great, in that context. In addition to opening a bunch of JDs and starting to hire full time. Overcoming systematic recruiting challenges due to location or other factors. We definitely have talked to clients and worked with clients that, this is pre-COVID, their office was in like a really inconvenient part of town, and so they struggled to get great people. Or, they had poor leadership before and their Glassdoor reviews are awful. And so it makes it really hard to hire. These are situations where you can get an A plus person via freelancing versus FTE more easily. Lastly, when you want modularity, so when you want to adjust the level of support and pay for what you use versus value-based retainer. So this is kind of what I talked about earlier, like mixing and matching, adding, taking away, is unique to freelancers because of the flexibility that they bring. Okay, setting up freelancers for success. There's definitely some overlap here with agencies. So treating them with respect for the internal team members, to talk through that. Investing the time to give them organizational context. This is a very direct way to overcome that con that they often lack this context. This is more important for some areas of marketing, like analytics requires organizational context, product marketing, branding. Certainly the performance marketing side is where that is probably least needed to be successful. Rewarding contrarian perspectives. Freelancers are uniquely situated to provide it. This is, in our view, this is really an opportunity to capitalize on something that they can uniquely bring and also model for the internal team. Like, hey, you aren't going to be penalized for thinking differently or challenging leadership on different things. Rather, we really want unique ideas and opinions that challenge the status quo. And then lastly, give very direct guidance and feedback. Sometimes we work with companies that are, understandably with FTEs, the relationship is very carefully managed. There's fear that if something is communicated too directly, it'll be taken poorly and it could create like a toxic work environment or an HR issue. With freelancers, freelancers thrive more on very direct guidance and feedback, and the stakes are lower, the switching costs are lower. And so if it's, if it doesn't end up working out, it's not that they're gonna, it's not that you're gonna have a toxic culture. It's just that, like, okay, you're gonna pull this in house or start working with another freelancer. So that I have found, as somebody who kind of leans more on the direct side, I've found that very refreshing as being a freelancer and also hiring freelancers. So, Katie mentioned in the intro how things have evolved, especially since COVID. Nothing has changed with FTEs being the core of most teams. And certainly agencies have been around for a long time. Really, the biggest movement we see is around freelance labor. It was already on the rise, like we saw it in some verticals more than others, but it was already on the rise. COVID basically just has supercharged it. Working remotely is now much more acceptable. Even companies that are going back to the office have a newfound willingness to consider remote folks on a contract or part-time basis. So this has been a huge accelerant to our business, and I think really any business that is part of this ecosystem. So we've talked about the components: FTEs, agencies, freelancers. Now the question is, how do you pull them together in an optimal way? I mean, this is the hard part. So this is sort of my definition of quote unquote the dream team. The dream team is a staff that dynamically evolves in skills, seniority, and capacity in response to business need as dictated by company strategy and feedback from the market. So, there are two major elements here. One is having the right mix of skill, seniority, and capacity. Like a marketing team at any given time needs, might need 100 hours total. It might be 60 at the director level, 20 at the manager level, and 20 at the associate level. And then, then there's like this skills mix. That's one piece of the puzzle. The other part of the puzzle that I think is at least as hard is, how does that mix change dynamically? How do you know how to change it, why to change it, when to change it, and then how do you actually have access to the resources to implement those sort of decisions? So I'm going to talk through these phases of the business and talk through some of the elements that we commonly see of how these get put together in an optimal way. So pre-product market fit. So at the earliest stage of a company's life, the vast majority of skills and capacity across seniority are sourced internally. There are a few reasons for this. The direction of the company changes quickly. The product solution changes. The vision is often founder driven versus data driven. And so it really requires a close knit team working with a founder to understand what that, what that vision is to define success. External resources, whether agency or freelance, are admittedly expensive. And so, like I was talking about when I started a company, we had raised a seed round of, I don't know, it was like $850,000. And so we didn't have that much runway. And, there were a ton of external resources that said, oh, we can help you with this or that. But it's just like, we just can't, if we do that with you, we can't do anything else. And so it just didn't make sense. And so invariably, early stage companies pull that in-house. They're working with, with a small group of team, typically generalists, and that makes it less expensive. It makes it more efficient from a time standpoint. And honestly, if you're looking for broad product market fit, you don't have to be specialized. You don't need to do email marketing to the 95th percentile. If that's what's needed, then to work, then you don't have product market fit. Usually, you see companies like finding great success, finding product market fit, even though they're not doing anything with total excellence. That actually is sort of further evidence that they're really onto something. So in summary, external resources are typically consultative in nature at the earliest stage. Typically freelancers or advisors, and it's typically, advisors for equity or freelancers doing light hours, helping to oversee the internal team rather than like doing a lot of the execution. At the growth phase, so opportunities far exceed capacity. This is a phase where it seems like, gosh, everything we do turns to gold. We just need to grab as much land as we can. And at that point, it's like, we just need people. Like, we just need to be able to pursue as much as we can, as quickly as we can. The direction is set, like the product is understood, or sorry, the problem is understood. The solution is already defined and rolled out. It's like, man, we just need to get we just get a megaphone on this. At this phase, specialization leads to excellence. So part of it is about exploring new things, and then part of it is about taking those channels that were, at 70% excellence, saying, all right, now we're going to go get 90% excellence and like quadruple the spend. External resources provide leverage, which has become more valuable than time efficiency. So yes, having two people, or three people doing performance marketing instead of one, you lose some time efficiency, but it allows you to do so much more. And that's worth it when you're in this sort of like crunch to grow as quickly as you can. Similarly, the opportunity cost of delaying, this progress outweighs the cost of external resources. So yes, external resources are expensive, but it's not as expensive as like not going into this new channel or this new tactic in the next 3 months, which would have been the case if you don't have the external resources. So this is really the phase where we see very, very heavy reliance on both agencies and freelancers. It's like, gosh, we just need as many as we can, and then it's crafting like exactly how, who does what and how they work together. And then there's like the mature phase. So usually, in my mind, this is marked by a declining growth rate. It's still a good company. They're still growing, but like they're growing 10% a year, 15% a year instead of like 150% a year. The landscape has largely been explored, and now it's time to systematically like cultivate it. Sometimes we talk about marketers as being in one of two buckets. Either they're like a hunter or a farmer. And a hunter is like going out and like finding something to eat. It's like, all right, what channel can I go make work? A farmer is more like, all right, how do I get 10% more out of this channel? And both are really needed. It's just sometimes they're different personalities. At this stage, the direction and tactics are really established. We're talking about optimizations, not step functions. Oftentimes companies start to look to consolidate resources internally. And at this stage, it's to save money. Sometimes we see this leading up to an IPO where they really want their bottom line to look good, or an acquisition. We also see an increasing sort of perception of skill commodification. So, when you first go into a channel, you want a specialist that's like, yeah, I know how to make this channel sing for your business. But after it works for years, sometimes it starts to feel easy, and a company will say, all right, clearly SEM works for this business. Let's go find the cheapest SEM expert. And, to some extent, I kind of scoff at that because, SEM is a really complicated channel. On the other hand, it is true that if you've got years of sort of working a channel, you know what works, you know what doesn't. It is true that a lower cost, sometimes lower seniority resource can continue to make gradual gains there. And then lastly, external resources remain for unique or hard to find skill sets, even at this mature phase. So, this might be for going into a new channel, or might be optimizing their team structure. But usually there's that kind of consolidation internally, and then external resources are for these like unique cases. There is an exception though, like some cases, some companies sort of really, they grow with agencies. Their sort of internal culture starts to depend on agencies, and so like the internal team is all about quarterbacking and all the execution is agency. So there are companies like that sort of just continue to work with agencies or freelancers in perpetuity. Typically those companies lean more towards agencies than freelancers. So last slide, just some general rules of thumb. So FTEs really need to set the vision, in our opinion. External resources can plan and execute against that vision, but it's really hard for an external person to set great vision. FTEs are best for quickly changing needs, which usually means they're generalists, and also for stable needs, like at the mature phase, where it's like a low-cost specialist. Freelancers are really great for everything in between. Agencies provide a trained resource, whereas a freelancer is typically an experienced resource. So from an agency, you'll often get somebody who has been well-trained on a playbook, but they're unlikely to have been in your shoes as a hiring manager. A freelancer is much more likely to have been in your shoes, but they were not trained on a playbook. Rather, they were responsible for sort of developing their own playbook when they were, in your shoes at another company. Agencies are great at deploying playbooks and driving scale as long as things go as expected. Freelancers are better at strategy and unproven low commitment tests. I definitely view freelancers as more commonly sort of that hunter profile, where they're like solving really hard problems that may not fit sort of in the standard, path you see a company taking or performance taking. And then lastly, agencies offer the fastest talent solution. In our opinion, freelancers can offer the highest quality. So with that, let's go to Q&A. Eager to see what discussion topics we have.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tyler. That was really great. So as I mentioned earlier on in the intro, you guys can drop your questions in the Zoom Q&A functionality. That would be fantastic, and we'll address them one by one. We'll give you guys a few moments to type everything out. All right, no questions so far. Give it a little bit more time.
Let's give people maybe 2 more minutes, and if we don't have any questions, then we can call it and give people 17 minutes back.
That sounds great. We did have one come in. I'm just reading this. Yeah, okay, so this is a good question, Tyler. When building for the long-term full-time team, how do you decide which functions to hire when? So for example, analysts versus channel leaders versus creative teams, et cetera, as it pertains or relates to performance?
So that's a great question. And Erica, please send a follow-up question if I don't address it in the way that you're looking for. Um, so, so a couple of thoughts. One is I strongly believe in um, staffing to solve problems like when you have them. So sometimes we see companies sort of proactively staffing very broadly across like, analytics, channel leaders, creative, before it really, before they really step in the water, before they're really, doing the work. And I would, I would recommend, so for performance marketing, for example, to start with an MVP where it might be, external creative with a channel manager doing briefs and a channel manager doing analytics, and see how far that can get you. And when you do that, you'll start to run into problems at some point in time or at some spend level. You'll get to spending, I don't know, 100,000 a month, and you'll say, gosh, our channel manager, can't really answer our hardest questions about the incrementality of these conversions. And that's sort of a cue of like, okay, we need to start thinking about, how we build out, an analytics capability. And as those things, as those questions crop up across, multiple channels, like, all right, we need to build out an analytics function. Same thing on the creative side. It's like at some point, you'll start pumping out so much creative, and you'll realize that it's not really optimal, and it's a lot. There's a lot of it. So it's like, okay, now let's up level that. And so I think my best advice is to start doing something, and um, and and to be as aware as possible of what the gap is between where you are and sort of best in class, and just kind of chip away at that. Um, that's sort of a philosophical answer. I think the very practical answer is that normally we see, like on the performance marketing side, channel managers kind of doing everything early on, because early stage companies just can't afford to have, an analyst and a creative director and a channel manager. And then as the spend increases, as the performance is good, you start to see, increased specialization. Usually that happens in the growth phase after product market fit.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Tyler. We've got another question here about decentralization. So Manuel asks, when do you fully decentralize your growth team? In other words, having mini growth teams within each area or product versus having a centralized growth team that services all areas and products.
That's a really good question. And it's a very hard question. We talk with a lot of companies about this challenge. Um, and I would argue that there's not a right and wrong answer. It's really just pros and cons of centralized versus decentralized. A lot of companies where they have a decentralized growth team, the challenge with that is that you get disparity in quality on the different teams, right? Like one product may have, a great growth, a great growth person working on it. Another product has a horrible one. That's tough. Another challenge, well, and that's hard to recruit for, like, right, you need more redundancy. Another is that, especially with things like paid, it can lead to conflicts. You don't want a Facebook manager um, representing like 3 or 4 different business lines, all targeting a US based audience. So, decentralized definitely has some challenges. Centralized, you get a central team that can be best in class, requires less recruiting, a smaller team. So there's some advantage there. Obviously, problem there is that they often lack some of the nuance and detail of those different business lines or the specific products, um, and they can be stretched really thin. And it's also hard to prioritize. It's like we often hear that that product or business line that is the smallest often really struggles to get resources from a centralized team, whereas when it's decentralized, there's no problem with that. So I don't know that that actually helps. I guess I would say one area where we see decentralized work more is when it's geographic decentralization. So in an international company, we often see decentralized teams by geo. So, there's a growth team for Latin America, growth team for, Europe. Um, that I think is a lot easier of a case to make than sort of decentralization within the same market. But I guess I would just say this is very, very nuanced, and it's like pros and cons. So I would tread lightly on anything I say there.
Cool. And another question he has is it better to hire roles based on the growth verticals like acquisition, activation, engagement, retention, and so on, or instead based on roles required in the team, like I need a data analyst, a marketer, a designer, et cetera?
Another good question. So I'm a firm believer, and I think we've seen this validated with a lot of the performance we see in companies that we work with. When somebody, if you want somebody to perform really well, they need to have a clear measure of success. And so a lot of times that means like I am responsible for filling the funnel, or I am responsible for the conversion rate, within the funnel, or I am responsible for, increasing the lifetime value of those that close, or buy, or whatever the conversion event is. And so I definitely would recommend having specific people, or if the team is big, specific teams that rally around these sort of singular goals. Um, I personally like the division across the funnel. It's certainly not, the only way, that you can do it. You certainly could have, a data analyst, a marketer, and designer for a particular product or vertical, and then they cover, the full funnel within it. Again, it's kind of pros and cons of like, two versions in a matrix org. Personal opinion, generally speaking, not applied to any particular situation. My default would be on sort of like funnel, and having the cross-functional skills against those versus vice versa.
Great. And we have a question from John here. Beyond looking at top line metrics, are there ways you have found to keep an agency partner accountable to their playbook, especially much of the day-to-day optimization that necessarily falls outside of your technical expertise or bandwidth to supervise?
Well, I mean, the kicker is the last part of the question, beyond the
Yeah.
bandwidth to supervise, because it, unfortunately, they just, even good agencies require supervision. And there's really there's no way around it. Like if you do not supervise, things will fall through the cracks. Maybe not in the first month, maybe not in the first 3 months, but when you've been working with them for a year, it just will happen. So I think the best advice I have there is not, it's not particularly, um, it's not particularly innovative, but being very detailed and sort of in a weekly status call, documenting, okay, what did we do this last week and why? What are we going to do this next week and why? And how does that map to a quarterly plan? And really reference those past notes and commitments that are made, so that at least you're aligned on exactly what's going to happen when. And you may be disappointed on the pace, but at least nothing is falling through the cracks. If you do not track it and you do not communicate about it proactively, you're very likely to be disappointed.
That's great advice. And then we have a question about PR. So Manuel asks, what do you think about having PR inside growth versus outside?
Um, that's an interesting question, and I guess I would say, I'm open-minded to having it inside. We typically see it outside of growth. It is admittedly really hard to measure the impact in a concrete way. Um, you know, PR people hate that, and often the metrics you get are really, they're really fluffy, like, oh, this many impressions based on like the circulation or like website visits of whatever. And it's like, it's kind of worthless. Like the ability to link that to any real business value is very minimal. And I do think that is sort of one of the marks of any growth team. Like you've got to be able to really measure what you're doing and the impact. Otherwise, like, is it, does it belong on a growth team or does it belong on a brand team? And so I kind of would argue, because it's so hard to measure, I tend to think it belongs more on a brand team. But that has the downside, right? Of like, It's about how the company is positioned in the press as a measure of success versus, like, did this drive traffic, which is a legitimate downside to doing it that way. So, I think the key is being in communication. So the growth team working with PR and making it clear that the PR team has their growth expectations on them, whether they sort of direct report into a brand leader and dotted line into growth, or direct report into growth and dotted line into a brand. It doesn't really matter. Like the main thing is that you're talking, and that the expectations are clear, and that best in class measurement, whatever that looks like, is taking place.
Great. So I think those are the only questions that have come in so far. Maybe we'll give it another like 30 seconds in case anyone's still working on the perfect phrasing
Yeah.
for a question.
I'll kind of extend that last answer, and we'll see if any other questions come in. But the same goes for, like, you'll see these like fights between product and marketing teams on things like SEO or email marketing, where like a product team wants to own it and a marketing team wants to own it. And then, like, there are all these debates like, oh, should it report into product, should it report into marketing? And I think the reality is that there's, either can work. Like, there are great examples of complete growth teams that live within product and do paid and traditional sort of like marketing things. There are also, like, great growth teams that roll into marketing. I think what I would argue is that regardless of what's a dotted line reporting structure or solid line, the important thing is to get a PM, someone that can influence the roadmap, and get a marketer who like actually has experience with, these channels, get them in the same room working together under a unified goal of growth. It doesn't, I don't think it matters that much sort of where they live, provided that the goal is growth oriented.
Absolutely. Cool.
Any other questions? All right.
I think that's a wrap then. Well, Tyler, thank you so much for doing such an awesome session on this topic. I know it's one that is very often requested from our audience, so I think it was highly valuable information you've shared today. And of course, thank you to everyone who's joined us on this Wednesday, mid-August. Very grateful to have you all here.
Yes, thanks for joining. Thank you, Katie, for putting it together.
Of course. All right. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.